This is Talkback with Peter Christian and John King. 721-1290.
Welcome, everybody. It is the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio and the inaugural show for 2016 featuring the brand new, spanking new Bob Seidenschwartz, the new and improved version for 2016.
My vow for 2016 is just to show up.
Oh, yeah, that's a good start.
and listen to you guys. Look, we got a caller that may be here right now. Okay. Saves me a trip to the car to get his phone number, which is what I was going to do. We've got our guest on the line, and Happy New Year, Missoula. It's good to be back, and this is going on 4 years now, Peter? We've been doing this? Wow.
Yes, absolutely, wow. absolutely. So, what is our guest's name? I know his first name is John.
Guandolo.
John Guandolo.
Oh, Guandolo.
Okay, Guandolo. So let's, I'm going to embarrass the poor man by just reading this very impressive bio. He is a terrorism expert. He's the author of president and founder of Understanding the Threat. He's a terrorism expert, speaker, author, former FBI agent, U.S. Recon Marine, a briefer to several U.S. presidents, U.S. military, police forces, special operation teams, SOPs, as we like to call them, and more. He connects dots, basing his remarks founded and proved directly from publications, recorded open source statements, and proven actions, words and deeds. He presents his facts, and the audience reaches their own conclusions while learning a great deal. He primarily presents these topics to allow the listener to have factual information and the documentation to allow them to challenge their own thoughts, ideas, and opinions, which is kind of what this show's all about. I mean, at least we like to think so anyway. John, good morning, and welcome to Missoula, Montana, sir. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. We've got Bob Seidenschwartz here. We've got John King, who you already spoke to on the phone, and about 28,000 Missoulians who tune into this show every day.
Okay, well, that's great. Sounds like it's going to be a good show.
So, John, good morning, and welcome again. You and myself had a chance to speak quite extensively yesterday, and what I had said to you and how we'll start this show is to allow you to describe your background, the entity that you represent, and something that you and I spoke to, which is really in talking about what that threat is. You had talked about Sharia, and I had asked you yesterday, and as we go through the course of the show today, when we come to certain terminology, please forgive us if Peter or John or myself interrupt you to say, please explain to the audience what that means. So when you're talking about certain descriptives, we're going to ask you sometimes, because we don't want to assume that our listeners know these definitions and the meaning. So, again, welcome. And, John, if you want to begin, please. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you. First of all, I really appreciate you all having me on. And I do look forward. Speaking to you yesterday, Bob, I realized that the format of this show very much fits, I think, what I like to do, and that is right at the onset here, I want to encourage your audience to challenge this information. And the reason I say that, which is why I like your show, I think you all will do that if you think that something I'm saying is not correct, is before I brief or teach or do anything I do, I always ask the audience to do that. And when I'm speaking to law enforcement and military especially, they have the most sensitive, if you'll forgive the term, BS meter of most people. They have very sensitive. They're very sensitive to people that are trying to smoke them or tell them something that's not true. And so I encourage them to poke around this, because for 15 years since 9/11, or almost 15 years, we have just kind of swallowed different narratives that aren't correct, and in some cases they're out and out lies about the threat we face. I actually just published an article this morning about kind of starting the new year and looking at the threat from a very basic standpoint, and that is, as you have asked, Sharia. So what is the threat? Well, I'll just start off by saying the threat is Sharia, and anybody that seeks to impose it by all means necessary, they then constitute the threat. And the Sharia is the game. It's the whole 9 yards. It's everything in this war. 100% of the enemies we face in this war, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood, the International Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Hamas, Hezbollah, fill in the blank. 100% of these organizations and the jihadis we capture on the battlefield, and people, in Paris and San Bernardino and in Fort Hood and in Washington, D.C. and in Seattle, Washington, and, name it, Little Rock, Arkansas, across the country that we arrest, they all say that we are Muslims waging jihad in the cause of Allah in order to establish a caliphate, the Islamic State, under Sharia law. That's their stated goal, 100% of them. And when you actually dig in and actually read authoritative public Islamic law, Sharia, you realize that all of it mandates jihad until the world's under Sharia.
Now, John, may I jump in here? This is Peter Christian. May I jump in here for just a moment?
Please.
Is there such a thing, and please forgive, I'm making quotes here with my fingers, is there such a thing as, quote, Americanized Sharia law? In other words, where certain aspects of Sharia law that folks who come in from Muslim countries would like to see instituted, and yet still somehow keeping a little bit of a framework of the American Constitution is kind of a hybrid deal?
No. As a matter of fact, to even have that discussion is a capital crime in Islam, and the reason it's a capital crime is because Sharia comes from the Quran and from the example, the sayings and example of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, who is considered the Insan al-Kamil, the most perfect example of a man in Islam. And so if it's in the Quran, which it is, and we can get into this in more detail on how the Quran needs to be understood, because if you don't understand it the way Islam understands it, there can be confusion. But when you look at it the way Islam and the law, Sharia, understands the Quran, and 100% of the scholars understand the Quran, then you understand there is not that confusion that we think there is. And then when you look at the example of the Prophet Muhammad, what did he do? He said, I've been commanded by Allah to fight the unbelievers until they testify there's no God but God. And then he went out and did it. And he killed people, and he and his men raped people. And they did these things that we're seeing on the battlefield today. So when somebody says that's un-Islamic or that's outside of Sharia, my question is where? Show me one book of published Islamic law that doesn't oblige jihad until the entire world is under Islamic rule. There isn't one. And that's why in the first grade and elementary schools and junior highs, in Islamic schools all over the United States and Europe and the Middle East, it's taught because it's what it is.
Hang on a second, John. John has a question for you.
Yeah, I wanted to back up to one of your early statements. You said that America was under a bunch of misinformation and lies. I was hoping, before we get too far, you could expose what you think the lies are that America believes.
Tell you what, we're up against a break, John, so hang on. We'll do this about every 10 minutes or so, and I apologize, but we're a commercial station. So we're going to take a quick break. By the way, we've just released the lines. 2 lines are open. If you would like to comment or ask a question, give us a call. John Guandolo joining us here on the phone. He's got an organization called Why We Fight, and understandingthethreat.com. So we'll come right back with more in just a moment. Welcome back to Talkback, brought to you in part by locally owned Office Solutions and Services. Download their Office Shopper app for purchases. Down to barcode scanning and to search products, and by Transport Equipment, your headquarters for RV service maintenance and repair. Transport Equipment, just south of the Y, next to the Axemen. All right, we're back. The Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Now, John, you just asked a question a moment ago.
Well, we opened the discussion with a really provocative statement that I felt we got away from really quick. But the statement from John Guandolo was that America believes a bunch of lies and misinformation about Islam. And I was just hoping if you could just throw some of the lies or what you purport to be lies to us so we can kind of get a basis of where you're coming from.
Well, John, and he also, he also said we're being fed this, which really I want him to go into in terms of who's doing the feeding.
Right.
And for what purpose and what ultimate objective.
Go ahead, John.
Right. Well, I guess first, if we simply take what I said early on, and I want to be clear about this, what I'm sharing with you is not John's opinion of what it is. I'm speaking about Islamic doctrine. And so my challenge to the audience and to people that disagree is, if you're going to say, well, that's not what it is, or that there's a different version of Islam than what you're saying, is my challenge to somebody that would say that is, well, okay, where is that taught? And what exactly are you talking about? Because I have no idea what you're talking about, because 100% of Islamic doctrine says what I'm saying. It says it's not a matter of debate. This is a matter of fact. So I want to begin with that. So when I said that there are things that are being told that are untrue about Islam, I would just ask this: since 9/11, when have you heard a government in the United States say what I'm saying about Islam? And the question is, why not? What we hear is that Islam is a one-off of Christianity and Judaism. One God, three Abrahamic faiths. I mean, this is absolute nonsense. And as a matter of fact, it's nonsense at the very root of what Islam teaches children in Islamic schools. They don't teach to Muslim children what our leaders say Islam is. And somebody should ask the question after 15 years, why not? Why is it that if I go to a mosque bookstore and buy books of Islamic law, and then I go to Borders or Barnes & Noble or Amazon and buy books about Islam that are not meant for a Muslim audience, why do they say exactly the opposite of what Islamic law is being taught to Muslims? That question has to be asked. And 15 years after 9/11, it still isn't being asked. We're not even asking the most logical questions. And let me back up and say this. Just straight war-fighting doctrine in the United States. Our war-fighting doctrine says in the United States that when we analyze an enemy, a threat, we do so by first taking them at their word of who they are and why they're fighting. And we begin our analysis there. And if we had done that after 9/11, then we actually would have had somebody in the Pentagon and the FBI and the CIA looking at Islamic law and actually opening a book of Islamic law in English, because, by the way, the primary language for Islamic law is English, because the largest Islamic countries in the United States used to be British colonies, so their law is published in English, so we can actually read it if we're Americans, if we actually chose to. But since 9/11, we have listened to our Islamic advisors, to your question about why I said we're not being told the truth and we're being lied to, is when we can, by name, identify the senior Islamic advisors to the National Security Staff, to the Pentagon, to the FBI, to the CIA, etc., as members of the Muslim Brotherhood, or in some cases other parallel Islamic movements like Tablighi Jamaat, or in some cases Al-Qaeda, guys from Al-Qaeda wearing suits like Abdurrahman al-Aboudi, who is in prison but was the Islamic advisor to President Clinton and Vice President Gore. In those cases, when you turn to your right or your left and you're a leader, and the guy you're asking advice from about what Islam is and what Sharia is, and he's part of the enemy movement, that's why 15 years later, our leaders are puppeting and repeating and regurgitating things that are simply factually not true about what Islam is and what it teaches.
Yeah.
And the way you would actually know what Islam teaches is to break open an elementary school book from any Islamic school in Europe or the United States, or break open a book of Islamic law.
Okay, tell you what,
I mean,
hang on, John. We've got a caller, and we do have one line open, by the way, so we like to get our callers in. Catherine, you're on with John Guandolo. Hi.
Good morning. Okay, would you discuss the concept of hijra as a component or a tool for the imposition of Sharia in countries other than Muslim countries in the Middle East? And would you speculate as to why leaders of countries, for example, Angela Merkel, are in support of this?
That is a great question. And while I think you're ahead of where we are in the discussion, I think it's important to answer it. First of all, why do I think leaders like Angela Merkel in Germany, are not getting it.
Okay.
And I would say I go back to what I just said, and that is that our European leaders and American leaders are looking to their Islamic advisors to tell them what's going on, which besides, by the way, being completely unprofessional, because you can't just pass off your duty as a leader to a third-party advisor. You still are required to know the thing that you have a duty to know about, but maybe that's going down a rabbit hole. So I think the leaders should know, and if they actually pulled their heads out of the sand and just cracked open just one book of Islamic law, Sharia, they would know. To your other question, what is the Hijra? And it is a part, it's actually a stated part in doctrine, in Muslim Brotherhood doctrine, as a part of how they attain victory, meaning the imposition of Sharia. And once they have a certain area to the state that they think it should be in, then the Hijra begins, which is the influx of mujahideen. And the Hijra is considered a part of the law of jihad. It's a way to wage jihad. There are many. Jihad is total warfare. Jihad is not just shooting guns, blowing things up, mortars, planes. That's not jihad. Jihad is total warfare. So it's influence operations, it's political warfare, it's subversion, it's espionage, it is military battle on the battlefield, and the Hijra. And the Hijra comes from when Muhammad left the Arabian Peninsula, when he was in the Arabian Peninsula in Mecca, spent 13 years there, and literally in the first 6 or 7 years only converted about 6 people, because he was totally rejected by the Jewish and Jewish and Christian scholars. But and in the 13 years he was in Mecca, he converted, according to Islamic sources, about 200 people. That's it.
Tell you what, we're up against a break here, John. Hang on, we're going to continue. John's going to be with us all the way till 10 o'clock this morning. So if you have a question or a comment, the lines are open. 721-1290, and Talkback returns with the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio in a moment. Welcome back to Talkback, sponsored in part by Bulls Eyewear, where they offer some of the lowest prices in town on contact lenses. See Lynette, 2910 South Reserve. Also brought to you by Selway Armory, our newest sponsor, actually returning sponsor, 2825 Stockyard Road. More guns and ammo than anyone in Missoula at the best prices in Montana, Montana's premier firearms dealer. Okay, we're back, and we're visiting with John Guandolo. And by the way, we forgot to ask you, where are you right now, John? Where are you located?
I'm in the Northern Virginia area,
all right,
outside of Washington, D.C.
Okay, welcome back. And we have to finish up with the answer to Catherine's question about Hijra.
Right. So the kind of the cap on that question was when Muhammad did his Hijra, his trip from Mecca to Medina, and he became a ruler. It's worthy to note that that's when the Islamic calendar actually begins, is when he made the Hijra. If you want to know how important it is to Islam, the Islamic calendar begins at the time of the Hijra, not at the time of Muhammad's birth or the time of the creation of Islam, but at the time of the Hijra. And that's when we see it go from a period of tolerance, is what Islam calls it, meaning no jihad, to a period of jihad. And increasing, first defensive jihad, then limited offensive jihad, and then jihad as a permanent command until the world is under Islamic rule. So that idea of Hijra, of Muslims in large numbers moving from one place to another, is a part of the jihad, and it's how they, according to Islamic doctrine, it says that people that do this, like these refugees, which are not actually refugees, they are actually considered mujahirun. Those are the people who are waging jihad through the Hijra.
All right. Now, we have about a minute and a half. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, we don't have much time to get into a big topic yet, but I do want to ask a question that will lead to a big topic. You've made the case that our officials in government, even our bookstores, are listening intently to these Islamic advisors who are linked with Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and all these other groups that have this goal of imposing a Sharia law caliphate upon the world. My question for you is, how did these, if they are there, how did they get so entrenched, and why the heck do Western leaders listen to them? If you could explain some of the history behind how this all came to pass, that would be great.
I would think part of it, John, is that that's what we wanted to hear, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, when somebody... Yeah, I will first start off this discussion, which will become a bigger discussion, by saying that...
Tell you what, hang on to that, because we're literally seconds away from what I have to burst in anyway. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. We have our hard break coming up, so when we come back after the top of the hour, we'll stretch out and talk about John's topic, and whatever you might have on your mind, the lines are open at 721-1290. We'll be back. Welcome back to Talk Back, sponsored in part by the Mustard Seed Asian Cafe, Kootenai Creek Village, Dig It Excavating, locally owned office solutions and services, transport equipment, Bullseye Wear, and by Selway Armory. Okay, we are back on Talkback, and joining us, of course, is the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Bob Seidenschwartz joining us here in studio from the Montana World Affairs Council. Also on the telephone is John Guandolo, who is with us from his home in Virginia, and we're talking about his group called Understanding the Threat, and he has a little paper in front of me called Why We Fight. Which is also very interesting. But right in the middle of a fascinating discussion about the whole concept of Islam and the fact that we here in America, and especially our political class, seem to have a very, very difficult time accepting what John says is the truth about Islam. So have I stated that correctly, John?
I think so, yes, sir.
Okay.
And John King had a question just prior to the break that I'd like to kind of pick up on and continue, because we're trying to stay on track with the thinking and background to this so we can kind of walk the audience through and not get too off track here. But
and for those skeptics out there, I'm being one of them. It's a hard pill to swallow that you've got all of the Western governments, you've got all of the bookstores in the United States under the sway of a small group of people that represent the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamic State or these other groups all together, pushing for a caliphate and pushing for Sharia law, and that everyone's just swallowing the poison pill. I guess my question for you is, if that is the case, how did it come to be that way? How did they become so influential in government, and why do the leaders appear to keep believing them?
Well, first I want to challenge you, and I'm not trying to be provocative here, but you just used the phrase small group. There's a small group of Muslims pushing this agenda. I mean, what's the factual basis for even asking that?
Well, what's the percentage of Muslims in the United States?
It's less than 2%.
That's why I said small group.
Okay, but I would say the majority of Muslims, I mean, we just look at polling data globally, have said that they want Sharia. And
you could have every Muslim in the United States advocating for a caliphate. It would still be a small group in the United States.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, you're saying relative to the larger population.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, the difference is, though, history has shown we don't need a majority group. I mean, how many, if we just go through history, how many members of the Communist Party, when Lenin did the revolution, and then under Stalin, how many members of the Communist Party were there? How many Nazis were there in Germany? The percentage of the larger population isn't, I don't believe, historically and practically is accurate, an accurate way to frame the discussion or to frame how we walk through this.
Even if you have a small number of people, though, the amount of power that Muslims hold in America, it seems on the face of it to be rather slim. You don't have prominent leaders, governors, or at least a lot of them, presidents, senators.
If I can jump in,
one senator, I think.
But you don't need it. I will just tell you this from my experience of working in Washington D.C. and up on the Hill, the national security program in the United States is being driven when it comes to our foreign policy and our national counterterrorism strategies. Is absolutely being driven by the Muslim Brotherhood. And the evidence of that is we can literally walk step by step these groups like the Muslim Public Affairs Council, Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic Society of North America, whose leader sits on the Homeland Security Advisory Committee and holds a secret clearance, and whose two primary directors have worked with the current Secretary of State and the last 3-4 Secretaries of State. So when you look at what they are advocating and what they push, which is part of what I teach and when I brief, when they push these things about shutting down programs, why don't we have what I'm talking about, my 3-day law enforcement program for military and law enforcement people that lays out the Muslim Brotherhood's jihadi network, their modus operandi, Sharia, and how local and state law enforcement can deal with this issue. The understanding the threat, my organization is the only one in the country that's still teaching this, that's been leading this. And the question is, why were the programs that myself and colleagues were involved in, why were they shut down in the FBI and DHS and the Pentagon? Well, because in 2012, these organizations, Muslim Public Affairs Council, Islamic Society of North America, and other Muslim Brotherhood Hamas organizations went to the White House and said, this training is offensive. Not, hey, this training's not true or what. It's offensive. It's offensive to Muslims, and it was shut down. If that's not a control of our national security strategy and our strategy at the state and local level, I don't know a better example. But I could give you 100 more. What I'm saying is that's the level of influence they have.
Okay, hang on a second. Hang on a second. We've got our lines full here. Everybody wants to talk with you, and we're about a minute away from a break. So we're going to get Roy on first. Roy, you're on with John Guandolo. We have about a minute before a break. Go ahead.
Yes. Good morning, John Guandolo and everybody else. First of all, John, I have two questions. I'd like you to define Sharia law, and second, I get information that our President Barack Obama, is putting members of the Muslim Brotherhood who support or encourage Sharia law into positions of authority within our government. And the second question, I'd like you to answer that. Is that true or false? I think you partly answered that previously, but thank you.
Thanks for your call, Roy.
Tell you what, Roy, we're gonna have him answer those questions after the break. So we're going to come right back. Sorry about that. We do have one line open. There it goes. We also have Bobby on the line that wants to visit with you, John. So you're immediately your honorary rock star now. You've filled up all of our phone lines. We're coming right back in just a moment. Okay, we're back on Talkback, and our guest on the phone, John Guandolo, and we're talking with a gentleman who put together an organization called Understanding the Threat. And Roy asked a couple of questions. First of all, real briefly, in a nutshell, what is Sharia? And secondly, is President Obama inserting members of the Muslim Brotherhood into high places in government?
So the first answer is yes. We have, like I said, we can go by name at the people that are working in the White House, on the national security staff, and working with State Department, Pentagon, FBI, CIA, DHS, who are Islamic advisors, who wear suits and act very polite and smile a lot and tell us that they're helping us. And as I mentioned earlier, and I don't think I finished the thought, is this is much more a counterintelligence and espionage issue than it is a terrorism issue. And that might help kind of crack some of that for your listeners, is that these guys wear suits, they talk very nicely, they have degrees, they're doctors and engineers, but they're jihadis. They're suit-wearing jihadis, and we need to remember that.
John, I got to ask you this.
Go ahead, Bob.
If what you're saying is accurate, I have to ask and have you explain, these people don't get into those positions without going through a vetting process by our security apparatus, correct?
Yeah, you mean the same vetting process that vetted the San Bernardino shooters and different levels of our government said they were okay?
This is what I want you to bring out. If this is being done consciously by the administration, i.e. the president, or it's being done in a clandestine fashion, somebody in the law enforcement community, somebody in the security community, to your point, has to be saying to somebody, look, here's their backgrounds, here's their ideology. Why are they in these positions to be then influencing and potentially changing doctrine and such? So I find it hard to not understand, I find it hard to understand, who's not vetting these properly. And is that possibly the really bigger issue for us?
Well, it's an issue. It's not the bigger issue. I mean, Listen, you just had a report and a public appearance on a news program for the first time by Philip Haney, who's a former Customs and Border Protection agent for the Department of Homeland Security, who I can tell you was their leading expert on this issue inside of DHS. And, of course, they forced him out because what he was saying contradicted the narrative, not based on fact, but based on, what we want to be told and what the administration is telling us. Now, the thing that you need to understand about him, this will answer your point, is what the DHS did is they removed names of terrorists from their database and from their watch lists so they wouldn't be harassed at the border when they were coming back into the United States. This CBP agent is alleging criminal behavior on the part of leaders at the DHS.
But why? Why would they take these people off why would they take them off the list? Who's giving them their directive to do so, and why, John?
Well, this is cracking open the big issue. There are all kinds of reasons why we are failing, why our leaders are failing. Some is because they're incompetent. Some is because they're dumb as a stump. Some is because they're bad people and they're doing it nefariously. And some is because they're more worried about their careers and getting their butt fried because you ask why aren't, what about the law enforcement officers and the people that see this going on? Because there's everybody in state and local and federal law enforcement knows if you stick your head up and say, hey, the problem is that Islam teaches this. They're teaching it at the local mosque in Virginia or Montana or Texas or France or Spain, and we need to address that. They are fired or they get an internal investigation.
Exactly.
That is the fact. So you want to know why?
And I think what happens, John, is the marginalization process begins at that point. So let's go and get Bobby on, who's been waiting a long time to visit with you. Bobby, you're on with John Guandolo. Go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, so we know that true Muslims deceive the non-believer in order to conquer them. We know that Obama, at some point in his life, went to Islamic schools and is enrolled as Islam. So he does understand what Islam is and what Sharia is. And he is steadfastly, at all times, he supports the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Rory pointed out that he has brought them into the government. They're in intelligence. They're in the Pentagon. They're responsible for scrubbing all reference to Muslim or to Islam from their training materials. And it's interesting how he is supporting Iran. I mean, he's totally behind them. And it's interesting that the Muslim Brotherhood found their birthplace in Iran. And also another interesting thing, I'm not positive, but I'm 99% sure, Valerie Jarrett, his chief advisor, was born in Iran. So I'd just like to hear your opinion on what I had to say, and I'll take it off the line. Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby. So, John, go ahead. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure the framework of the question, but I'll just say yes. I mean, one of the questions I get asked more than most is, about the president's background and all that. And I just say I'm not going to make a judgment on whether or not he's a Muslim. I can tell you that Islamic law says if you are born a Muslim, and he was because his father was a Muslim, that makes him a Muslim at birth. But before you reach puberty, if you renounce Islam, then you're no longer a Muslim, and there's no penalty for you. But after puberty, if you continue and you're a Muslim and you leave Islam, then you're an apostate. And the president's been called an apostate by Muslims overseas. But I more look at, if you look at who he is and his policies, when people say, why would he do this? He grew up with a Muslim father, a Muslim stepfather, a mother who was a kind of an amalgam of socialist Muslim. According to the president himself, his number one mentor was a guy named Frank Marshall Davis, who was a member of Communist Party USA. He followed and actually taught Alinsky-ism, which is Marxist revolutionary ideology, Rules for Radicals, which, by the way, is a book dedicated to Lucifer, the devil. And the president taught that. And my question, if that's what we know about this guy, where exactly does his loyalty to the Declaration and the Constitution. Where would that come from?
Okay,
There's no.
Go ahead.
I lay that out for the caller as my answer to that question.
Okay, we're up against a break. Alan and Eric are on the line wanting to visit with you. Bob is screaming. John has his hand raised. And so anyway, we all want to come after you, John. No, we're just kidding. We're going to come right back as we continue our conversation with John Guandolo. Agree or disagree? If you can't get through on the phones, and right now you can't, make your comment on our Facebook page. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. It's Talk Back, the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio, having a provocative discussion with John Guandolo, and he has an organization called Understanding the Threat, and folks have been waiting a long time.
That's right. We've got Alan on the phone. I don't know if you know this, John, but he is one of our most popular callers. I get calls all the time about people.
We love Alan.
Praising Alan's calls. So thanks for calling in, Alan, and here's John Guandolo.
I'll give you that 20 later, John. Good morning, John.
What's up?
Well, I think if we stop and look, we have an example of what's coming here. All we have to do is look at Europe and see what's happening, in particular Germany and Sweden. And I'm just curious, do you believe that the German culture and the Swedish culture can survive what's going on right now with this invasion?
Okay, that's a great question. It opens up a big door, but I'll try to keep it tight. I think different countries in Europe are going to respond differently, and I don't mean that just flippantly. I mean historically. I think Germany is going to respond. I will tell you from speaking to people and being connected to what's going on the ground in Europe that they are moving a lot closer than the Western media is leading you to believe to a real stage of violence in Europe against the Muslim community. And it's because the leaders are not doing their jobs. I think...
is this like civil vigilantism? Is that what you're predicting for Germany?
Yeah, but I think it's going to be more organized than that. But yeah, it's going to degrade pretty quickly. Because people are already, I mean, listen, you just had over the weekend thousands of Muslims that were sexually assaulting women at a train station in Cologne. I mean, now there are close to 100 actual arrests and, incidents of rape, men physically beating women because they were
John,
uncovered.
Why was this not reported?
I've read about this.
It was. Okay, so where did you read about this, John? Because I'd like people, when somebody says something like you just did, I always ask our speaker to say, where can you go to get information about this story so that people can vet and read for their own purposes?
I'll post a link to it.
The two sites I would recommend besides my own, understandingthethreat.com, one site, Robert Spencer's site, jihadwatch.org, constantly, every day, basically what he does is he filters the media and gives you the nuggets of what's going on in the world. But on the international level, when it comes to the global movement, Global MB, as in Mike Bravo, MB as in Muslim Brotherhood, Watch, globalmbwatch.com, gives you an international flavor. And if you read that website, even just once a week, you will see that what I'm talking about this global movement is extremely organized. And it's not haphazard and random at all. So
there's articles in like the New York Times from the Cologne police chief condemning the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, there's phraseology that gets a little bit more tempered and a little less tempered all across the internet.
So let's get back to the phones. We have one more caller, and by the way, lines open now, 721-1290. Eric, you're on with John Guandolo. Hi.
Hi, John.
Good morning.
All I see Islam as the front men for our out of control government, and you guys have touched on this. That if we wanted to shut this down, we could stop allowing them in, and we could have a long time ago. And this didn't start with Obama, and it's not going to be solved with somebody like Reagan. And until you come to that, this will never be solved. All Islam is a battering ram against the founding principles of this country used by elites. And if you want to find out Obama's real devotion. Look at the Wall Street banks that he's bailed out and the pharmaceutical and the insurance companies that he's passed laws for to enrich them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So your response to that, John?
I don't know that I have much response. I think he's correct, and I think it's worth noting that there is another parallel movement in this country, which is the progressive movement, that in my opinion is as dangerous or maybe more dangerous, because it's the reason that our leaders have become, for the most part, unthinking and unable to reason and think logically and factually about a real threat. This whole idea of moral relativism that, as we were discussing, Bob and I yesterday, cannibalism or communism or Islam is no really better or worse than a constitutional republic. And really, who are we to say it is? Because that just means we're colonialists and isolationists and rude Islamophobes and whatever other nonsense. But the idea of the West being the cradle of ingenuity, the cradle of humanity, is self-evident in the last 1,000 years of history. And it doesn't mean Western civilization is perfect, but certainly what Western civilization and the Christian underpinning of Western civilization has produced is truly self-evident when compared to all the other systems of government. But I think the progressive movement is also, it may not be a battering ram. I always consider it's the cockroaches eating away, or the termites eating away at the foundation of a home. And I've actually used the analogy that your caller just used of Islam is the big, wrecking ball that comes in and takes a swipe once the termites have already eaten away at the base. So I agree with your caller.
I wanted to ask you for your prescriptions for success against this danger. Obviously, you've characterized our government as being misled or ignorant or foolish or evil at times. And in light of that, what do you think they should be doing or could be doing to prevent all these evils from pouring into the United States, or for overtaking country in Syria, or for expanding through borders in Iraq and out of Iran? I mean, what should we do on the global scale and locally to help alleviate some of the ills?
And we're going to get that answer when we come back from the break. Dwayne is waiting to visit with you as well. We have one line open, and, of course, our Facebook page. Talkback continues in a moment. Welcome back to Talkback. It's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. That's John King. I'm Peter Christian. Bob Seidenschwartz joining us. And John Guandolo joining us from his home in Northern Virginia. And we have folks waiting on the phone, but you had a question.
Yeah, tell us some steps America should take. You've pointed out a lot of the problems, but what are some of the solutions?
Well, because of the failures at the federal level, and by the way, if we identify this using military standards, and once although we haven't detailed it here in this discussion, I do in my book, Raising a Jihadi Generation, quite explicitly, and people that follow my work and my writings at understandingthethreat.com get plenty of that. The network here is so significant that this can be likened to an insurgency. And in a counterinsurgency, the focus is at the local effort, and the local police become the tip of the spear. So I spend most of my time these days working at the state and local level, state legislators, state attorney generals, local elected officials, local police, state police, and business and community leaders.
Telling them to do what?
Well, first of all, they need to understand the threat. And then once they understand the threat, there are legislative measures that a state can take. There are measures at the law enforcement level that can be taken. And if laws need to be created to help local and state law enforcement, then legislators that are educated can do that. And I work with them and share with them some legislative options to do that.
Give us an idea of one of the laws that you think would help protect us.
Sure. There are, Andy's Law, which was written because of Andy Long, Private Andy Long, who was killed at Little Rock, Arkansas Army recruiting depot by Abdul Hakim Muhammad several years ago, I guess about 5 years ago. And that essentially says that if they can show that certain organizations aided and abetted somebody to do an act of jihad, then they can be charged in ways that weren't previously part of the legal code. We have Sharia finance laws that are essentially terrorism finance laws, divestment, like Iran divestment, any business doing business with Iranian organizations, they can be cut out legally and without any threat for civil repercussions. And there are a whole bunch of laws. There's the American laws for American courts, which we shouldn't even have to have in America today, but essentially it says that no foreign law can be used in a court of law in order to adjudicate certain matters. So there's a whole group of legislation that is out there, and new ones. There are probably about a dozen pieces of legislation that are working their way around the country, and many of them have already, been passed by, 1 or 2 dozen state legislators. Then now the whole refugee resettlement thing, but at a local level, I want to get back to the local level. Once local police and state police understand the network, the Muslim Brotherhood Hamas network, and where those organizations are, well, that right there, those facts go towards probable cause and reasonable suspicion to begin doing investigations at the state and local level. And their complaint is the FBI is not going after this network at all. And so, the FBI is totally focused on people that want to shoot people or blow things up, but they're not going after the network that supports all these. I mean, if you go through all these incidences, starting with San Bernardino and working back to 9/11, almost 100% of them you can tie directly to Muslim Brotherhood mosques, Islamic centers, and organizations. And so,
hold on a second, John. Bob just jumped out of his seat.
You just said something there, though, which makes this very difficult. The FBI doesn't want to go after it. The locals are starting to understand this. The FBI understands this. But if you start doing this, then what are you doing that becomes very offensive to many people in this country, which is identifying Muslims as a threat, which then lends itself to the entire narrative of what we've been hearing recently, which is we don't want to start having Muslims identified in negative fashion. We don't want to have people religiously and ideologically identified in this way. So until you can deal with that and present your argument in a way that allows this to be had without that narrative countering that, I see that you're going to have a very difficult time.
Well, see, I think I am explaining it that way. I'm saying anybody who supports Sharia and imposing it at all costs is a threat, because Sharia necessarily requires our form of government to be destroyed and an Islamic form of government to be established. That is not only a violation of anybody's constitutional oath, it's a violation of federal law. It's a violation of the law to conspire to overthrow the U.S. government, among other things like treason, sedition, other things. That's what we're talking about here.
John, do me a favor. In the 2 minutes between now, we have to take a break. I want to be faithful to Roy, okay? Because he asked quite a long time ago if you could just give us a brief capsule definition of Sharia, please.
Sharia is Islamic law, and it comes from 2 primary sources: the Quran and the Sunnah. The example of the Prophet Muhammad, who, as I said, in Islam is the most perfect example of a Muslim, of a man. And the Quran can only be understood when abrogation is understood. 3 times in the Quran, which is, according to Islam, the uncreated word of God, Allah, God to them, says that whatever comes chronologically later overrules legally what came before. So chronologically, the last things in the Quran are chapters 9 and 5, which say that jihad is an obligation for all time. Fight and slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war. And for Christians, Jews, and anybody that had a holy book at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, they get the 3rd option. So for pagans, convert or die. For Jews and Christians, you can convert, you can submit to Islamic law, you can pay a non-Muslim poll tax, You live with reduced rights under the Islamic State, but you're allowed to keep your life, and you live under the Islamic law as a dhimmi, a non-Muslim in the Islamic State. That's what Islam says.
All right. Perfect.
So that's where it comes from.
We'll hold it right there. And we'll take a break. We'll come back. We have Dwayne and Joe, and I'm sure our Facebook posts are also going big. So we'll only about 20 minutes left in our program. So if you haven't had a chance to call in or write in your response, we'll be right back. Okay, we're back. 721-1290 is our number, and John Guandolo joining us on the telephone, a group, his organization called Understanding the Threat. And the threat is Islam and what it threatens to do to not just our country, but the entire world. But our lines are full. I want to get right back to the phone. Dwayne has been waiting the longest. Dwayne, go ahead. You're on with John Guandolo. Go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
John, I want to ask a question that has a long thread to it. Peter Baker and Mark Mazzetti, who write for the New York Times, reported that John Brennan, director of the CIA, is not only converted to Muslim beliefs and refused to take his oath of office on the Bible and took it on the Constitution, and further that Greg Ford, who was with the 223rd Military Intelligence Battalion, claimed that while Brennan was station chief in Jeddah, approved the visas of the 19 plane hijackers for the 9/11 tragedy, which also now John Brennan has allowed for 680,000 visas to be issued to predominantly Muslim and terrorist states who are settling in Dearborn, Michigan, Hamtramck, Michigan, who has its first Sharia mayor, and Islamberg in New York, in New York. And all of those cities plus 20 are fully under Sharia law, not U.S. law. Can you speak to that?
Thanks, Tom.
I can only... yes, I can speak to all of that. I would just, to keep it succinct, when I reported my piece of that John Brennan story, much to do was made about that because they thought it was such a high, a far-fetched thing. And all I said was, look, I don't know what John Brennan does every day, and I don't know if he's practicing Islam. What I do know is I have two sources who are still in the government that were in Riyadh when he was the station chief for the CIA, and he said the Shahada, the Islamic Statement of Faith, in front of not his own colleagues, but in front of, while there were Americans present, but in front of Saudi Arabian government officials, including members of Saudi intelligence. Now, all I'm saying is that sounds like a recruitment operation from one intelligence agency recruiting a CIA station chief. If you understand how this operates, for people that have no idea, they simply say, oh, well, he's just, it's like somebody converting to Christianity. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is because you have government officials in the room and intelligence agents from another, so then the outcome and the intention is nefarious right off the bat.
Well, do you believe that, it sounds like the insinuation there from our caller was that John Brennan was a jihadist of sorts that was allowing the terrorists into the country.
In other words, he's working as an agent for Islam
He's promoting.
Right. Well, what I will say is if you listen to his speeches, he frequently speaks at known Muslim Brotherhood Hamas organizations like the Islamic Society of North America, which the largest Hamas and terrorism financing trial in American history, in Dallas, 2008, Holy Land Foundation versus the U.S., the evidence demonstrated ISNA is not only the, quote, nucleus for the Muslim Brotherhood's movement here, they are a fundraising arm and financial arm for Hamas, a designated terrorist organization, and he has and continues to work with them to give speeches, to talk about how great they are. And so my question is, what's that about? Because if I'm not mistaken, you could put a criminal charge on someone doing that. And by the way, the president made a promotional video for ISNA last year.
Okay.
Just a sidebar.
Okay, hang on
what-
just we have. I'm sorry, we have other folks that want to jump in here. So let me just before we get in too deep on that, Joe, you are on with John Guandolo. Go ahead.
I hope this is relevant. I try to think of to communicate with various people, and especially I find women are interesting in that, the Islamic laws aren't that kind to women and tend to be like property. But I came up with a little joke with my girlfriend, and I said, well, geez, I suppose if we just made peace with Islamic people, then we could kill two birds with one stone. We could also, since women wouldn't be able to drive, we could lower the carbon input, And she thought I was serious. But I had to say, no.
I don't hear a lot of people laughing at that one there,
She's still your girlfriend?
And then the whole idea of slavery, I know they're trying to recruit African Americans into this jihadists too, But the idea that you can have slaves now, I mean, geez, what a wonderful thought.
Okay, thanks for the call. So, any comment on what he just said?
Nope.
Okay.
He took care of it.
All right.
I would like to get back to what you were saying, because you broadened it. Instead of narrowing it to Mr. Brennan, you broadened it to the president. Do you believe that the president and the head of the CIA are complicit in supporting terror activities?
I think the facts would say yes. I mean, the president is negotiating with the number one state sponsor of terrorism on the planet, Iran, and we're releasing literally, I mean, the number that's being thrown around is $150 billion back to them. But, Iran was directly involved in 9/11, per the 9/11 Commission report, by the way. We don't talk about that. We don't talk that they are right now the number one funder of Hamas on the planet. Just all of this. And yes, the president is supporting groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a Hamas organization, for evidence, facts. I don't know if anyone remembers what those are, but in counterterrorism trials, he's got advisors from the Islamic Society of North America, which the court says he had his deputy national security advisor go to the mosque in Sterling, Virginia, the Adams Center, whose president was at the time the head of the Islamic Society of North America, and praise the guy for coming to the White House and praying at the iftar dinners. This is a guy who is a jihadi. So what, if you just lay the facts on the table, what else are we supposed to think? Now, we could believe that the president is as dumb as a cinder block, and so is John Brennan, or that there's an intentionality here.
Okay, and with that, we're going to take we have a 1 minute timeout, and then we're going to rock it right until the top of the hour. Our guest is John Guandolo. Both lines are open, by the way. If you have been trying to get through and got frustrated, lines are open now for the next 8 minutes, and then, hey, John's going to have to go. So don't miss this opportunity. We'll be right back in 1 minute. Okay, we're back. His talk back, 721-1290, Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Bob Seidenschwartz, you had a question for John Guandolo just before the break was over.
Yeah, John, as I'm listening to this, I asked myself this question I posed to you. So what's the end game? What's the end game of if the president is, as you say, if Brennan is, as you say, and many others, that this has been well infiltrated within our governmental hierarchy, what's this end game?
Well, I think if you just look objectively at the policies and the direction we're going and how we're allowing our enemies to have access to our system, I think the end game is a defeat for the United States. Now, what does that look like? I have articulated for quite a number of years, and certainly in the last 6+ years, that every month that goes by that we don't address this problem, we back ourselves into a corner where the only way to rectify the situation will be through violence, meaning through use of force, through law enforcement, military, and all of our legal options and all of our social options and all of our policy options will become mute. And that's where we are now.
John, I want to ask you a question. And I'm going to frame it in a specific way. America has always prided, well, most of America anyway, for our very brief history, has prided itself on being a, quote, Christian nation, end quote. So I guess, should the question, or could it possibly the question be framed that America has a choice? Either you can retain your heritage as a, quote, Christian nation, or eventually become a Muslim nation. Is that a realistic question?
It might be a realistic question. It's not a question that the founders or anybody that understands our founding would realistically engage in. Let me just say this on that question. The founding document for the United States and for who we are is the Declaration, not the Constitution.
Right.
The ideal is the Declaration. The Constitution was the first attempt at taking the ideal articulated in the Declaration and putting it into a form of government. And the foundation, according to the Declaration, is the law of God and the law of nature, law of God being Scripture. So this discussion about whether America is or isn't a Christian nation is not even, if we had people who actually historically and reasonably were going to have a discussion, is not even a realistic discussion. Of course it is. The principles of Christianity, according to the founders, is what holds us together. And no law, according to William Blackstone, whose legal texts were used for the first 160 years in this country and all of our law schools, said any law that violates the law of nature or the law of God is no law at all, and we as citizens don't have a duty to obey it. And the reason is because on that pillar of the law of God and the law of nature comes a form of government that says that our rights as human beings come from God, and no man and no government can take them from us. Therefore, we surrender our right to self-government to create a government whose whose primary purpose is to secure the liberties that God gave us. And out of that comes the rule of law that cannot contradict the law of nature and the law of God. And out of that rule of law comes liberty. And in a society based on that liberty, you get prosperity. So if you want to pull out the underpinnings of all of that, then you can kiss all of your prosperity, not just your liberty, all your prosperity, your home, your car, your iPad, your iPhone, and you can just flush it down the can, because that's the natural outcome. If you want to look at what an Islamic society really under Sharia looks like, look at Afghanistan under the Taliban. Look at Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. Now you can say Saudi Arabia, well, they're a rich country. Well, they're rich because they're sitting on a pool of oil, but look at how the human rights of people in Saudi Arabia are handled, where homosexuals are killed and women are treated the way they are, and et cetera, et cetera. And look at your communist countries. Where else in the world? That's why America, because of our founding, has been the most prosperous and free nation in the history of the planet.
And we have exactly 2 minutes left in the program. So, Bob, I know you wanted to wrap things up here. So.
Yeah, John, I want to give you a chance to please tell the audience, if they want to learn more about your organization, and of course they're listening to you today, where do they go to, and what is your final message to us here in Missoula? And I suspect we may have you back on the show again if you'd be welcome to that opportunity.
Well, I'd certainly love to be back. I love the fact of your format, that you have an open discussion, that you ask the tough questions, and you poke around. That's the way I like to do business, and I think it's the way that reasonable people with reasoned minds do things. My website is understandingthethreat.com. My organization does a number of things, but primarily some of the courses that I run are a 3-day program for law enforcement, which I do usually one a month, sometimes more than that. I've got a couple in the upcoming months. And I run a week-long program that I'm actually going to be doing the first week of February, a week-long program for people who already understand the threat, who want to be able to teach it to others, called Train the Trainer, which people can contact me. We're actually finalizing the list over the next couple of days. So,
hey, John, we have 1 minute left. So give us some specific contact information.
Right. So understandingthethreat.com. I can be reached there. Email is simply john@understandingthethreat.com. I have a book, Raising a Jihadi Generation, which summarizes the Muslim Brotherhood Network here, and I have a 90-minute DVD that lays it out in video format, the evidence and all the trial information, as well as the practical how they do what they do. And then I've got a list of my resources most of them, almost all of them are free, of all the key documents with an explanation from these trials that will help people understand the threat. And my final thought is I have great hope that we can deal with this. But if anyone is waiting for the federal government to deal with this, I'm here to tell you this is going to be answered at the state and local
We
level.
are completely out of time. John, thank you so much. Walt Kiro on tomorrow on Talkback. We will see you then. Have a great day, everybody.